Our next speaker here at the 10th University of Chicago International Education Conference is Professor Susan L. Burns. She is Associate Professor in the Department of History and the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations here at the University of Chicago. She is an historian of Japan's long 19th century. She is interested in the social history of intellectual and cultural practices and the continuities and ruptures between what conventional periodization terms Japan's early modern and modern eras, or between what conventional periodization terms Japan's early modern and modern eras. In recent years, Professor Burns has become interested in the use of digital tools for historical research, specifically ArcGIS and text mining. She utilized ArcGIS in her research on leprosy to explore the place of private leprosy hospitals and clinics in the cityscape of late 19th century Tokyo. She is currently working on a digital project called Mapping Medical Tokyo that seeks to visualize and analyze the spatial dimensions of health, disease, and medical care in the Meiji-era city. Professor Burns is also the director of the University of Chicago's Center for East Asian Studies. Please join me in welcoming Professor Susan Burns.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming to this event. Welcome to the University of Chicago, and thank you very much for that lovely introduction. I wanted to point out that I'm also the chair of the Collegiate Affairs Committee of the History Department here, and in that capacity, I'm deeply concerned with teaching, how to effectively teach history, how to make our students feel that history is important and relevant. And so I think I share some pedagogical aims with you all. So today I want to talk about my work with an online platform called Esri Story Maps. And there are a number of things out there on the web with similar names, including StoryMap.js and MapStory. And these are certainly worth exploring. But I myself have been working mainly with Esri products. And so that's what I'll be talking about today. Let me say that although I'm an enthusiast for Esri's free platforms, I'm not on their payroll or anything like that, so feel free to investigate some of these other options. I don't know if you all are familiar with Esri. It's a tech company that promotes the use of GIS technology. So this is, of course, the technology that allows you to figure out where you are, where you want to go on your cell phone. But of course, it has a range of other applications, both for corporations, for scientific research, but also for research in the humanities, where we are concerned with issues of space. So what is Story Maps? Story Maps is an online platform that allows users to combine maps, images, video, and text to create a narrative or make an argument. So it's a way of presenting a cultural or historical story in a kind of multimedia way that is visually very appealing and very accessible. It's free. This is a kind of outreach thing by Esri. They charge a lot for some of their other technology, but you can register for this and get a free account very easily. The other thing I really like about Story Maps is that it is a kind of out-of-the-box way to get involved with digital applications, but without spending time to learn programming. Story Maps is super easy to learn and use, and Esri provides great support. The other thing that I think is great about Story Maps is once your students individually are working in groups or as a class, create a project, you can publish it online on Esri's server space. So you don't need to have server space at your own institution, nor do you need any IT assistance to get it up and running, although it's quite easy to embed your story map project on your school's website or on your personal website if you happen to have one. And while I'm mainly talking about story maps today, I also want to point out that Esri also has another free platform that's really worth investigating, and this is called ArcGIS Online. So what ArcGIS Online does is allow students to make their own maps with multiple layers of data. And so if you want them to explore, for example, changes in the city of Chicago over time, there's a way that you can do that very easily with ArcGIS Online that creates an interactive map that allows you kind of to scroll through and see how a neighborhood or the city as a whole has changed. And I have the link up here, and I believe the PowerPoint will be given to you guys as PDFs after the fact, so no worries about taking notes or pictures. You'll get this. Let me talk a little bit about Esri and me. As Alex mentioned in his introduction, I got interested a few years ago in mapping when I got involved in a project. I'm a historian of medicine and public health, and I've been working on a history of leprosy for many years. You probably don't know, but in the 19th century, leprosy was an endemic disease in Japan and at very high rates, unlike China and India, countries that still are dealing with leprosy. But I knew from my research that there were leprosy clinics in the city of Tokyo, and I had the names and addresses. Leprosy was in Japan, as in many places, a highly stigmatized disease. So I was wondering where in the city these hospitals were located, and I thought that figuring out where they were might tell me something about, the feelings that surrounded the disease. And so I got interested in learning ArcGIS, and this is one of the first maps I produced. It's a map of Tokyo circa 1900. And the different colors show you population density. The darkest colors are the most densely populated areas, yellow least populated. And then I also put in the public transportation system as it existed at the time. And then I plotted my hospitals marked by the red cross. And I discovered something that I thought was quite interesting, and that is that many of these hospitals ended up being in very densely populated parts of the city and very close to transportation stations, streetcar and train stations. So that told me that while the disease was indeed the object of stigma, it did not mean that the people with the disease were ostracized. In fact, they lived in close proximity to many other people. I could go on with the story since this is what I've been working on, but I'll leave it there and tell you a little bit then about how I began to use this technology in my own teaching. So for many years, I've been teaching a course on the history of Tokyo called Tokyo Society in the City. And each time I taught this course, I grappled with a number of issues. For one, I was very interested in having the students think about cities over time in a comparative way. But most of my students, in fact, had never visited Tokyo. And so I thought, how does one get people to understand a city that they have no real experience of or direct experience of? I also wanted to help them think about issues in relation to Tokyo, such as socioeconomic class, ethnicity, work, access to transportation and other services, how these kinds of things shape life in the city at different moments and over time. And these, of course, things we're still grappling with in our own city. Finally, I wanted them to think about how the city changed over time. You may know that Tokyo was almost completely destroyed in 1923 due to a great earthquake. And then in 1945, due to extensive bombing, the city was destroyed again. So I wanted some way to get the students to think about how these kinds of events affect the way the city, well, who suffers in relation to these events most directly, but also how the city emerges from a disaster like this and what kind of changed form. Now, as I'm interested in teaching the content of my own research area, of course, I'm also interested in teaching fundamental skills. So I want students to come out, even if they've forgotten everything they ever learned about Japanese history, with research skills to know how to find and evaluate secondary literature, primary sources, images, journalistic accounts, and so on. I want them to learn how to write good, clear prose that is accessible, but also which expresses their own sort of voice and style. And of course, I want them to learn how to make an original argument. And I think that this platform called Story Maps allows me to do both of these things, to teach the skills that I think are important, but also to teach content. And so this is the opening page of Story Maps, and I'm just going to show you a little bit of what it looks like. Okay, so this is Story Maps, and you can, well, if you log in, you'll see that there's a place on the upper right-hand corner where you can make your own account. And then here are what they call apps. So Story Maps, what makes it really lovely is that it is meant to be something that you engage with yourself, by yourself, without help. So they've created these different templates here that you can scroll through. And they provide, this is, if you want to get started, you can go there. There's an overview of what they think are the distinctive features of this template. There's a gallery where they show you some of the presentations other people have made. There's a tutorial that walks you step by step how to use it. And then there's facts that contains information that might be helpful, like what would be the optimum size of the images to bring them in, and if you want to embed it in your website, how you can do that. So really everything you need to get started with Story Maps is available here. Now, they have, I believe, quite a few different ones. I'll show you just the very easiest template, and that's what they call Story Map Basic. But anyway, let me sort of introduce to you some of the work that students have done using this, and then we can talk a little bit more about its applications. Now I have to get back to PowerPoint, and I'm back. I did it. Okay. What a relief. So let's see. So these are the different types of templates that the Esri people have created for you. As I said, Story Map Basic is just basically one map, and you click different places and see images. So it's the simplest one. What I've had my students work with is Story Map Journal and Story Map Tour, and those are sort of the classic ones, and I think in some ways the most interesting one. So let me talk about the assignment that I created in my History of Tokyo class. So I wanted them to create a story map journal that addressed lived experience in Tokyo in a well-defined historical moment. And we were sort of combining story map with ArcGIS Online, the map-making platform. So part of the assignment was that they had to make 4 different maps and incorporate that into their story map. And then they also had to include images and text as well as the maps they made. This was my first experience teaching with story maps and with ArcGIS Online, so I didn't know what to expect, and I was really thrilled when I got these great assignments at the end of the quarter. Now let me say that this was a history class, that nobody was a tech whiz, nobody came in knowing anything about either story maps or ArcGIS Online. And our terms here are only 10 weeks long, so it's quite short, but they created these really great and sophisticated projects. So I'll just show you a couple of these. These were all done by undergraduates. So this was one, you may or may not know that in Japan, really until the 1950s or 60s, many people did not have bathing facilities in their own home. They used a public bathhouse. And it's really only in the era of the economic boom in the 70s forward that you see new construction in which everybody had a bath. So this student was really interested in where the surviving bathhouses are and what that could tell us about the city. So we did this really fantastic project. CENTO is the word for a public bathhouse. So he has a little introduction. So this is the story map journal form, where you basically are sort of scrolling through a set of images and text and maps. So he has a little introduction about bathing culture in Japan. And then this is the map he created. This was really a mapping sort of tour de force. He found out that there are about 500 existing bathhouses in Tokyo, and he mapped all of them. I think this was the most extensive mapping project in the course. So then the rest of the project unfolds, sort of trying to figure out how to make sense of this distribution. So he did a series of sort of neighborhood studies, looking at discrete neighborhoods and where the bathhouses were. He did a map that shows the ward concentration, so the darker spaces are the more densely residential areas, and that would be where the most bathhouses are. He did a hotspot analysis. This is something you can do very easily on ArcGIS Online. And then after he'd sort of done the sort of regular bathhouses, he looked at these new kind of bathhouses, which are called super sentos, and they're more like a theme park organized around bathing, which is actually a very big thing in Japan. And then he has his conclusion with a very nice image. So you can see, I think, the format of this, right? That you can take maps, images, and text and embed them together to tell a story. So I'll show you one more. This was actually done by one of the junior students in the class. I believe she was a second-year student. Okay, yeah. So this student was interested in student protest, and she knew from our class that there were two great moments of student protest in Japan in 1960 and in 1968. And she made really great use of an archive of sort of photojournalistic kind of images, of these really vivid ones of sort of street violence in Tokyo. And so she did a number of really interesting things. She created this map that shows sort of global protest around the world in these moments. She incorporated these historical maps to try and make us aware of the difference between Tokyo now and then. She identified where the protest took place in 1960 in relation to population density. She discussed the media coverage. Another historical map, circa 1968. And then a map that shows how much more widespread the protests in this era this year were. And again, a population density map. And then a kind of national view. So again, I think you see how you can take maps that students made, images of different types, and the text. And so it is a research project, but it's also incorporating these other skills. Now, I gave you in a couple of sample assignments in your handout, because I can imagine, if you're not already sort of into maps, it might seem a little daunting. But my colleague, Kate Craig, who teaches at Auburn University, put together a really great project, which actually I think goes very well on the morning session about images of objects in museum collections. So this was for a world history class, and it was called Around the World in 42 Objects. So in this case, I think there were 42 students in the class, so she created a list of objects and had students choose the one they wanted to work on, and then they created their own individual story maps using the story map journal form for the object they had chosen, and then these were linked to a story map tour form that she was responsible for. So we can take a quick look at this. I think this would be really easily adaptable, for a middle school or high school assignment. Yeah, so this is the story map that her class, working collaboratively, created. And so what you see here at the bottom are the objects that she chose, basically moving through time and also around the world. So it's got a nice kind of chronological element as well as a spatial element. And then each of the students was responsible for creating the page on their object. And so we can take a look at one of the student-created pages. So this is a fertility figurine from Metropolitan. So the form that she told the students is they had to come up with what she called a hook, the intro that sort of made pose the object in an interesting way, and then they each had to compose 3 questions that would be answered in the remainder of their page. So in this case, the first question was, what culture created the figurine? And then you see the answer to that. The student composed. What was the purpose of the object? And the student's answer. And then, what can it reveal about early Mesopotamian views on equality and the class system? And so each student made this single page, and then they investigated the coordinates of the place where it was. And this can be done very easily just by searching Google Maps, and then once they had the coordinates, it's easy to create the interface that shows you the place of the map. So this is a really interesting interactive kind of thing, because you click a place, it takes you to the object, and then you can investigate the object further by scrolling down.
Was this done in the story map basic?
This was done with story maps, yes.
Basic or?
No, I think she had them work with Story Map Journal, but this could actually be done in Story Map Basic. Yeah, so you could have each student doing their page in Story Map Basic and then linking it to the class one with the coordinates. And I've got her very detailed step-by-step instructions in the handout. She's a very generously shares them with everybody online. Where was I going? Yes, okay. Another one of Kate's ideas is she's actually medievalist by training. And so she did this course on medieval history, and she was trying to go against the idea that, medieval Europe was this very insular society where people sort of stayed in their villages and so on. So one of the things that they were reading were actually sort of travel logs of people's accounts of where they went. So each students worked in groups of 2 or 3 to sort of map the travels of some individual person, like Marco Polo did that, for example. But the example that she shares is one of this medieval traveler who, it's quite an interesting story. I think he was born in Tangiers. He ends up going as far as the Volga River into what is now Russia. He makes it to China. He goes to Tanzania in Africa. So I won't show it for reasons of time, but if you're interested, take a look at it. The students creating maps to show his really elaborate travels around the world. And again, this was one of a series of projects that were created in this class. So let me sort of move toward a conclusion. Why is story maps useful? Well, I think for one thing is it allows you to teach multiple important skills at the same time. So by doing Kate's around the world in 42 objects, students learn research skills, writing skills, they learn about geography, they get engagement with art history, and of course they're learning history, but all of this in a new and really visually appealing format. You know, it looks really sophisticated, doesn't it? But really the templates are really designed to be very user-friendly. So, you know, if you follow their tutorials, you're popping your image and your maps in the text, and it creates something that looks, I think, very sophisticated, but without a huge amount of work on the part of you or your students. As you may know, students today might not see the value of writing a report or a term paper, but actually many of them do see the value of producing web content. And so this is an easy way to allow them to do something they're interested in, creating web content. Of course, they could link it to their Facebook page or whatever. But it's also doing, I think, what we as educators want them to do. And I also think that it's a really powerful kind of exercise in public writing. That is, you're teaching your students that writing about this stuff is important, that people can see it. I found that my students were really, I don't know if there's anybody who's like shared a term paper with their parents or their friend, but my students were like telling me, oh, I sent the link to my story map to my parents, and they were so impressed that I could do this. And I was really impressed with the ones they did as well, of course. Potential problems. You know, even though students are immensely skilled at using social media, many of them are actually not as tech savvy as one might imagine. And I would occasionally, you know, when they were complaining, say, hey, middle-aged me can do this, so can you. So I do think there's sometimes students will feel like it's a little daunting, but I don't think it is. And if you, with the good handouts and a little sort of attention to the tutorials, and starting easy, I suppose. I think I made the bar of my assignment a little bit high, although they all rose to the challenge. I've also noticed that while students, like all of us, like to complain, so on the one hand, you know, they get bored writing papers. On the other hand, they know what a paper is, but they don't know what a story map is. So sometimes, you know, you can see kind of resistance. And in my class, I had one boy who repeatedly said, couldn't I just write a term paper? To which I had to say repeatedly, no, you can't. You must make a story map. And another question I think that comes up, which is perhaps a point of anxiety on both the student's part and the instructor's part, is how do we grade this, right? And so in the handout that I gave you with two sort of sample assignments, I also included two sort of grade rubrics that the instructors drew up, which give you some sense of, you know, how you can evaluate these things. And so, you know, there's an attention to how much research went into it, the writing, and so on. So I think this can be, you know, make it seem less daunting than it may seem to you, and also just transparent to the student. I feel students often really value this transparency in grading. Was there a question before? Yes.
Yes. All these maps.
Yes.
Is there a big, so all these maps, are there, is it a resource on the story map? Is for all those maps that if you want a map of Chicago, they'll have it?
Yes, they do. Oh, well, yes, they do. They do. And so it's all linked. I mean, Esri is a map-making country. So yes, you can find easily.
Like I need a map of Chicago, it pulls it up for you,
That's right.
brings it over into
Absolutely.
the story.
And they actually offer you multiple options. You know, there's topography maps, street maps, all different kinds of options depending on what the project is, so that you can have.
Then it'll have another page where you maybe just want an image.
So the images are, you have to create the link.
And you drag them into?
Yes.
Or do you have to create a link?
You can't drag them in, you have to have a link. So usually if you find it on a site, you put that link into story maps, and that brings the image in. Yeah. So it's really sort of HTML code that's sort of,
I see.
so pretty neat.
Going all over.
Yeah. But the thing is, you don't have to worry about that. You're just cutting and pasting links in once you find the images. Yeah.
From anywhere, from Google, anywhere.
Anywhere, yeah. And
How powerful.
it is nice, yeah, it's really nice. Yeah.
They created in text citation with this, or is everything just then going to a final bibliography slide?
Yeah, so the, I didn't scroll all the way down, I don't know, but there's citations at the end of the text of each of the student pages, both for my assignment and for the ones that Kate's students did. So the sort of scholarly apparatus of citing your sources and acknowledging where you got the images from, that can all be in there, and should be in there. Was there another?
I have the same question.
Oh,
How do they cite their sources? Do they put them in the story map?
Yes,
Okay.
yeah, just at the end.
So everything that they've cited, or everything they've included from somewhere else is cited at the end?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
On the map that you created,
What was that?
on the map that you created, or your student created on the, you put in hospitals, you put in bathing houses. So you pulled up a base map of Tokyo, decided on the scale that you wanted, and then you actually figure out what icon you want to use, and then you manually go in and input those manually.
Yes, yes. So the map I created, I was actually working in the desktop version of ArcGIS, which does have more functionality. But all the maps that my students had in their presentations were done in the free version, the online version of ARC. The things about population density, you need to have that information, you have to have that, but it's easy enough once, if you have that data, to create a map of population density in Tokyo circa 2016 or whatever it is.
So if you have your own base map of Tokyo and you want to have, say, different districts than you can find on the base map, you can then create those wards or those districts and shade them the color you want.
Absolutely, yes, you can. Yeah. So the map that I did, I outlined the wards and, created a layer for population density. I created another layer for transportation, and then another layer for where the hospitals were. And then the final map, it brings all of the layers together.
So it's like having transparency and you're laying 1 or 2 or 3 layers over top of the original map.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Other questions?
Just to clarify, story maps is within the ArcGIS site.
So both Story Maps and ArcGIS Online are 2 free platforms that Esri has created. And so they work very well together. But, I will say, the requirement to make these maps that you saw in my students' work, that was my own individual requirement. But you don't have to do that in Story Maps. You can work with maps that are available on Story Maps that you're just pulling in. So, there was this added layer in my assignment because we were doing a lot about thinking about space and those things. So I had them make their own maps and bring those into Story Maps, but you don't have to do that. You can just take the maps and plot what you want. In the way the 42 objects was, that was one of Esri's, maps they made freely available to you, a world map, and then you're just plotting where the objects originated from. So it's not that complicated. Mine was sort of 1 layer more complicated than that project. Yes.
So you do those 42 objects chronologically. Is there a simple way to put them chronologically?
Oh, absolutely, yes, yes. And again, the story map travel thing, allows you to do that. So it's just embedded in the template. So in that sense, sort of investigating each of the templates and figure out what they can do in relation to the project you're thinking of is sort of one thing you can do. I'm some of it a creature of habit, and now that I know, the journal and the travel and the basic form, I just keep using those, but I shouldn't venture out for 5 minutes.
And you will have a link to your story. Do you take
Yes,
that?
once you publish it, you get the link to your story, and that's the thing you can share, you can embed it on the website, you can do whatever you want with it, yeah. So it's really quite generous of Esri to host this. They make a lot of money on the commercial stuff, so. But anyway, just a couple of final things. Story Map, Esri Story Map offers great support. They have a kind of forum where you can submit questions, and the Story Map community, people chime in to give you help. They also, and they're monitored by Esri technicians, so they also will jump in and give advice. There's sort of troubleshooting. If you're having problems, there's a troubleshooting place you can go to and see if other people have had the problem and it's been answered. I also want to point to the fact that YouTube is a great resource. I did a quick search when I was putting together my PowerPoint using Esri story maps, and there were 5,000 plus video tutorials that people had made, different people who are interested in using story maps that will also sort of walk you through different functions that you can sort of follow step by step. And then, of course, if you have questions about, conceptualizing course plans or anything like that, I'm a story map enthusiast, so feel free to shoot me an email and I'll do my best to answer. Thank you all very much.
You said you're going to send us your PDF.
Yeah.
On your slide.
Yes, I will. I will send a slide. You're welcome.
We have a couple minutes for questions. Are there any other questions before we finish up this session?
You said you only used a couple of the alternatives. Do you have any idea about what's the strengths or weaknesses or degree of difficulty of some of the other programs or alternatives you could have chosen?
I haven't done a lot with them, mainly because I came into the Esri technology through my own research, and so I was sort of familiar with the way that works. But I spoke with Kate Alberg, who's much more of a digital humanities person than I am, and she said she'd evaluated them and felt that the story maps was the most versatile one, and it also has the best support. But we didn't have a lengthy conversation about what were the shortcomings of the other ones. But it is, Esri is a huge multinational corporation, and so I think what distinguishes this from the other platforms is that it's kind of the, industry standard, and so there is this huge community and lots of support.
So you found more professors or teachers using the Esri platform than the other 2 or 3 that you listed at the
Yes,
beginning?
that's correct, yeah.
And within the Esri platform, you had about 6 to 10 alternatives, and you said you only focused apparently on a couple. And
Yeah.
do you know, like, in the 5,000 YouTube videos, do they cover
They
a
do.
variety of all of those?
Yes, they do. They do.
And are you aware, does Esri have anybody out there that kind of promotes this at the different levels?
Promotes it? Yes, they do. They do a lot of outreach. Yes. So there are these kind of, if you sign up for the Esri list, they will send you lots of stuff about, these kind of events where there'll be somebody from Esri talking about the uses of Esri technology for teaching. So I would encourage you, if you're at all interested, to get on the list, and you'll get flooded with emails, some of which is pertinent to what you want to do, some of it not, but it's still worth investigating.
All right, one last comment or question?
So I'm looking at a middle school maybe activity here, and I really like that one map where you were able to show the map of the Middle East, the little targeted boxes that open up.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you had any, I have an idea, maybe giving the class that map and then having each student open up the box and put in a summary of what was found. Can you do that sort of thing with this platform, like send a map out to like 30 students and have them each individually open up their own little workstation on there? Can you see that done?
I'm not quite sure that but you want to get them involved in doing a similar kind of project?
Well, I was thinking as a teacher, an educator, to put maybe 10 points on a map like they had on that one platform. They had spots on the Middle East. And then as you hit each icon, it opened up a room for narrative.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if, like, for a middle school activity, if I were to set up a map like that with the icons and then send that map out to all my students, they would be able to open up the icons and put their own little summary of that spot. Is that possible on this platform?
Oh, that's a great question. I actually think you have to do it the way Kate did it, which is first have them each do their own sort of like a story map basic, which would be writing the text. And then on place, for example, so you wouldn't even have to have an image. If you just wanted to have text, you could do it on either the journal or the basic form. And then you could create the link to the spots. So I think it would have to be, you'd have to have that sort of page done first, and then go to the next step of making the link. Do you see what I mean?
So as an administrator, can I maybe make a map? And
You
then
can make a map.
So in other words, it would just be like they would do on Khan Academy. I would send out the problem with a map, and then each person would be registered for this website, but then they can just receive stuff from me. Is that possible?
You know, I'll be honest and say I'm not sure, because I've only ever done the reverse. But you know, if you give me your email address, I'll investigate and get back to you.
Okay, that'd be good.
Yeah. Or just shoot me an email, and I think I put my email address up on the slide that you'll get. So you can just shoot me an email and remind me I'm the guy that asked that question, and I'll get back to you on that. Is there another
So
hand?
you're not necessarily downloading something, you're always working through your browser, accessing what
That's
you
right,
created.
it's all online, absolutely, yes, all online, so nothing remains on your desktop. But you know, you don't have to, you know, it's not visible until you launch it. So while it's under construction, nobody sees it, but you and your students. So that, you know, it can be a work in progress, sort of sitting on every server space until we're ready to make it public.
All right. Thank you very much. Let's get